Hey, good evening, everyone. My name's Adam.
And I'm Rishi.
So welcome to another episode of This Is Not a Drill. This really is not a drill that we're living through. We're on Organizing Upgrade. Thanks to Real News Network for holding down the tech and the video production tonight. Today, Rishi and I are going to talk with leading left organizers and strategists about how the health, the economic, political crises that have we're living through are shifting the terrain that the organizers on the ground are facing. Each day, there's been new developments. History is definitely speeding up. Today, we learned that Bernie Sanders suspended his historic campaign. Yesterday, we saw a deeply flawed and dangerous unjust election happen in Wisconsin. We have more and more people sick from the coronavirus, and in many cities around the country, Black communities are being hit hardest and worse by this pandemic. So we have a lot to talk about. We have guests that have knowledge and direct on-the-ground experience about all these crises and how to fight back. Tonight, we're really focusing on strategy, moving beyond the demands that everyone is creating for how to make the world better, how to make the country better, and actually getting down to strategy of how we're going to win these things. So keeping it all in international and internationalist context, we've invited folks who we believe would help us guide us through the strategy.
So before we introduce our amazing guests, we want to make sure that everybody has the date of our fourth and next episode on their calendars, which is Wednesday, April 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be another powerhouse group, much like our group tonight, with Maria Svart, the National Director of DSA, Andrea Mercado from New Florida Majority, Jonathan Smucker from Beyond the Choir, and Alejandra Rojas from Justice Democrats. Make sure to join us at that conversation for what's going to be another amazing discussion. But let's start by meeting tonight's amazing, excellent group of guests. These folks are all strategists or organizers serving our movements in some capacity. We have Vijay Prashad, Director of Tri-Continental Institute for Social Research and the Chief Editor at Leftward Books. We have Phil Agnew from Smoke Signal Studio and a Senior Advisor to the Bernie Sanders campaign. We have Angela Lang, the Executive Director at Black Leaders Organizing for Communities in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we have Laurel Wales, Director of Power Building at People's Action. We want to remind our guests to not wait for us to ask a question directly to them and to just jump in to weigh in on the conversation. And I'll turn it over to Adam to get us going.
Thank you. All right, so starting with Vijay, we want, like I said, we want to move from demands to strategy, but we really should get clear on kind of what are the broad demands we should be working with. You have perspective and studying around the world what's going on. Maybe you can just speak to how the conditions confronting organizers have changed from your perspective since the pandemic has really accelerated, and what should movements be fighting for in response?
Well, it's very nice to be here, and I'm glad to be with these very sharp and important people. I'd just like to make a couple of points. One is that I think it's important to understand that movements around the world, political movements, social movements, have seen sadly their understanding of the world confirmed. In other words, for decades now, political and social movements of the left have argued that these vicious, inhumane cuts against the health sector, against the education sector, against basically civilization, these inhumane cuts were going to create a serious problem. And, indeed, we've had now COVID-19, the disease, demonstrate, unfortunately, the correctness of that analysis. In La Jornada newspaper in Mexico this last week, Victor Silverman and Miguel Tinca Salas wrote a very fine piece in which they said the virus comes from nature, the crisis comes from neoliberalism. I thought that put it very pithily. But I'd like to also say that it's our movements, whether it's in Kerala, whether it's in South Africa, it's our movements that are on the street in public action, providing relief to people, helping shape mutual aid for people. It's our movements that had been critical of the system that are nonetheless out there to basically bring humanity into the world. Based on this, our institute, Tri-Continental, alongside the International Assembly of the Peoples, which is an international platform of 200 organizations, including the Communist Party of Nepal, Workers' Party of Tunisia, the Democratic Way Party of Mexico, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, we came up with a 16-point declaration, which made very concrete demands in the present, in other words, around relief, but we also made demands on the future. We believe, for instance, that there's no returning to normal, because for us, normal was the problem. We don't want to return to the past. We don't want, let's say, in the United States, a return to the sort of warmed over corporate Democratic Party represented by Joe Biden. We want the future. We have bigger demands than the past. We don't want a kind of left nostalgia. We want left future. That's what we want.
Yeah, just to jump in and riff off of where you're going, I really appreciate everything that you just said, and it's so spot on. I think the thing that we know and just have to remember in this moment is that capitalism and neoliberalism creates these crises, and it is intended to happen, and we know it is going to happen. We've seen it in the past. So I've been spending a lot of time looking at our history and what have we learned from previous collapses that we can think about in this moment for where we could go bolder, bigger, stronger, and really fight for what has been happening in our communities forever and use this as an opportunity to make big waves moving forward.
Yeah, really quickly, I think, well, one, I'm honored to be on here with all of you all. It's very exciting to see heroes, peer heroes, mentors of mine from afar. I think in addition to agreeing fully with what has been mentioned, it is our duty right now, in addition to demands, to be building organization. I know that sounds basic. I know that sounds duh, but in this moment, when we are winning the ideological fight, we are still contending with people wondering whether the way of life that we are demanding and the way of life that we are proposing is actually possible. It is up to us to build not only organization, but be able to provide the service, right? To provide the example of the alternative and what it looks like on the local level. I think local organizations, national are obviously very, very powerful, international even more powerful. But locally, what we have been able to do here in Florida and in Miami is in small ways begin to show what the way of life that we are proposing looks like. We have already won or begun winning the ideological war around the necessity for us to have health care, for us to have a social safety net in the United States, the preposterous nature of us having so much wealth concentrated with such a small amount of people and so many people not having anything. We have begun to reach a point where we're beginning to scratch the surface on a tipping point of winning that battle. But people want to know, what does it look like then? Capitalism is evil, but what is this contract that you all are talking about, what it looks like? And I think if there is a silver lining is not the way to phrase it, but if there is an opportunity strategically for us, it is for left organizations to begin through direct service, through just being in the streets as much as possible with an abundance of caution, showing people what it looks like when organization and when people have the power to decide what their communities look like, what their blocks look like, what their houses look like, is an incredible opportunity for us.
Phil, if I could follow up with you on that, and then I want to bring Angela in here. One of the biggest changes since our last show aired has been the declining prospects of Bernie to actually win the nomination, culminating sort of Bernie ending his campaign today. There's a lot of broken hearts out there, and I'm sure for you and others in the campaign, there's a lot of feelings and reflections. His campaign gave a lot of focus to the sort of otherwise disconnected groups and demands that were circulating. Even more so during the pandemic. What, in terms of strategy, what can we really learn about what worked and what didn't work in the campaign?
Yeah, I want to be the first to say that my heart is not broken, actually. My heart is, we are up against generations and generations of a really deeply entrenched ideology and hegemony, and we began to crack that. I am sad that the campaign is ending. I'm more sad for the people who were moved by the campaign and see no political hope right now, and that's where my heart really is. To answer your question directly, though, I will say what I think the campaign has done really well in the last 3 weeks of the crisis, talking about the crisis here, is that they have begun to elevate demands. There's a way that we can craft our demands that broadens the conversation, right? And so when we talk about people in prison, right? When we talk about homeless and houseless people, when we talk about the sites of work, right? We say that essential workers do go to work and do provide essential services, but there are people who do essential work in the home as a site of work and as a site of labor. And that has been something that the campaign has been able to do to broaden the conversation in the moment. And I really think that was one thing, without talking too long, and we have other people that want to jump in. That's one thing that I saw really happen that I got excited about, that we were saying that domestic work is work, that people in prison actually are human beings. And this crisis has allowed us to draw out that dissonance that people had that allowed them to not see the home as a site of labor or prisons as a site of labor or a site of dehumanization. We've been able to do that.
Thanks, Phil. And we'll come back, I'm sure, we're kind of weaving the Sanders campaign into a lot more of the discussion. But I do also want to ask, Angela to jump in here, because you just had an election yesterday. A lot of people were watching what was going down and worried about the people on the ground. And also Milwaukee and Wisconsin is could be a real bellwether place for the rest of the country. It was clearly important in 2016, and it's always important. And so just wondering kind of any reflections you have on the elections happening there yesterday and what they might teach us about kind of tactics and strategies for us moving into the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think yesterday was devastating for a lot of us, for a lot of organizers who've been on the ground trying to do some of that civic education. For BLOC, what's really important for us is to make sure that we are a year-round civic engagement organization. We are teaching people to understand the civic engagement process and to have people really reframe and to think about power and really think about where they fit in the system. And it's disheartening to know that how much you try, how much you give your all, you start to understand and getting, more civically engaged. There's just another thing that just smacks you down. Unfortunately, I've seen some heartbreaking images. I've seen, long lines from yesterday. And, a lot of what happens in Wisconsin is seen as a test case for what the GOP wants to try and get away with for the rest of the country. And so, the world was watching. I think the world was disgusted from what happened yesterday. Somebody tweeted at me just to show the gravity of the situation. They tweeted at me, "My sister is a cancer survivor. I am disabled. My absentee ballot arrived and had been mailed. Her ballot never arrived. For the first time, she will not be voting. It's a crushing day." I couldn't help but to think and reflect of my own mother, who I got to vote for President Obama for the first time in 2008. And that was kind of me really getting involved. And my mom also passing away from terminal cancer. And that tweet really stuck with me about how people go through really extraordinary circumstances in order to make their voices heard, whether it's dealing with a terminal illness, whether it's learning the process, whether it's, reshifting your schedule and risking your job, and in our case yesterday, risking people's lives in order to make our voices heard, has been incredibly disheartening. I think we've known the ills of capitalism and white supremacy, but it was also disheartening that a lot of Black and brown organizations for several weeks now were calling on leadership to postpone the election. And there were people on both sides of the aisle that didn't think it was going to be a problem. And I think what was very illuminating to me is that people really wanted to win so bad. In Wisconsin, we are so polarized, that we are so focused on winning, that sometimes there's, quote, progressive and Democrats that think that winning by any means necessary is the end game, and they're willing to do it off the backs of Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And I think there's going to be a real uphill battle. And I think we've taken a giant step backwards in actually bringing in marginalized folks and in communities of color into this engagement process and having them feel that their voices actually matter when stuff like this continues to happen.
Yes, and I was just speaking with some folks in Georgia today who are in that same position of they have an election coming up in a month and are worried about the impact as they're one of the later states for this to hit. Whether some people still calling for it to happen because of, I think, some of the what you're describing, but others starting to realize that it needs to be postponed. You want to bring in Laurel and Rishi?
Yeah. Laurel, I want to start talking about People's Bailout a bit. Some major initiative that's been launched. People's Action has been one of the many groups moving it. People's Bailout outlines 5 principles that federal and local legislators should follow as they respond to the pandemic. It's a broad effort, lots of groups, ambitious goals. Given the conditions we're facing, what opportunities do we have to really and seriously advance this agenda to win? What's the plan and strategy to get there?
Yeah, such a great question, and it kind of tying some threads from what I heard from the other speakers on the call right now. I feel like the thread comes back to organization and building a bigger we and a builder base right now. So to what Phil was saying, it's one thing to go out and demand a bunch, but there's a lot of people that are in pain and are grappling and wrestling with what is happening to themselves personally and folks in their community. And, as organizers, I think it is our duty and responsibility in these moments to care for folks when that happens and to help them realize that they aren't alone, that private pain they are feeling is not an individual feeling, that there are more people, and it is a public pain that we need to bring to the fore. So first, I think I really love everything that's in the People's Bailout, and if there aren't people behind it, we won't actually have the power to move or win anything that is in there. And so for us at People's Action, it looks like bringing in our base first, the people that have been organizing and are with us, to really think about how do we reach even more people in this moment and do the pieces that move folks from direct services that they need, care and support and community that they need, all the way up to being able to take action. And I really hope out of this moment we come out with a whole new wave of radical left organizers that are ready to step up in their community and take on. And if we don't do that, if there aren't people behind it, I worry that we will just be the same left movement with looking at the same people frustrated that we can't get anything done.
Yeah. And just to ask you a follow-up there, Laurel, given the sort of physical distancing guidelines that people are facing, what are the tactics you feel like are, aside from the sort of mutual aid stuff, which I think is, I totally agree with you. It's core and center. You can't have any kind of credible mass politics if you're not leading with primarily taking care of folks on the ground. But when it comes to sort of taking action to fight for broader demands, what are the tactics you feel like are sort of most in play, or new innovative tactics that folks should be really paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I'm hungry for this discussion and curious if anybody else has awesome ideas on this front. Have been seeing things pop up, like in Minneapolis today, action on the banks to make sure that they're taking care of our renters right now. And so cars and bikes and trying to figure out other ways to gather while still being distant from each other, I've started to see pop up. And then I think we have to talk as a movement to get more innovative about our ideas and what we can do here. I've been sitting with a ton, what would it look like to mass mail a one place or a particular target? Or what would it look like to do more street theater and art that can reach into communities and people can hear it from their streets so they're watching and can see where we're going? And I think anybody right now that thinks they have the answer to how we're going to solve this is we're not there. But the thing for me is we have to be in a collective to really solve and reach for the stars in this moment.
I think just to jump in, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think mostly due to my own anger and frustration. And I joke around with a lot of friends of mine, and I'll just send a lot of just fire emojis, meaning like I just want to burn it all down at some point. Yeah. And, what does it really look like to really get people out in the streets? And then, as other folks said, like we have to be cautious about it. Not everybody has the privilege to do civil disobedience, and we need to make sure that we're protecting our folks. But I think for several years now, we're starting to reach kind of like this precipice, and things have been bubbling up more and more and more. And, what this is showing us is that a lot of organizers, a lot of activists, a lot of folks that have been around have been working on things like paid sick days. And now suddenly we're having these conversations again when everyone thought that paid sick days was crazy. Roughly like 10 years ago, there was a paid sick days campaign here in Milwaukee that failed. And now we're starting to have these conversations again. And it's like, what does it look like if we would have had all these things in the first place, where people thought that we were crazy, if we had this stuff now? And I think there are folks who are hard hit that maybe wouldn't identify themselves as political, that are like, all right, what do I have to do? Not just since 2016, but, really acknowledging the moment that we're in right now. And what does it look like to continue to move forward and to be radical? It's a word that I've learned to hate, because I feel like we're only asking for basic things and nothing we're asking for is actually radical. But what does it look like to actually take the streets, to make sure that our demands and our voices are being heard, and not just electorally? BLOC is really centered in a lot of electoral organizing, but we also need to be very honest with our communities. We are very much honest with our folks. Voting is not a silver bullet. It is not going to get us free, never has, never will. It is one tactic at our disposal, and we really need to start to educate folks about what are the other tactics in making sure that we can work for collective liberation. And also there's some tough conversations that need to be had with progressives, again, quote unquote, and the Democratic Party, because I think there's a real reckoning, especially today, with Senator Sanders suspending his campaign. There's a real reckoning happening where people do not feel comfortable voting for Biden. I've seen some social media that said, so we're going to swap, one, sexual assault person, racist and sexual assault person for another. And those things, we need to have those conversations. We need to wrestle with that. We need to acknowledge how people are feeling, instead of constantly telling people of color and marginalized folks, you just need to fall in line. We've fallen in line so many times. And now y'all got to hear it. You reserve the right to withhold our labor and our votes and our voices unless our demands are being met, because it is not fair for marginalized communities and communities of color to constantly, secede so much for the sake of the Democratic Party when we get nothing in return.
Well said, Angela. If you don't mind, I'd like to pick that up, because I think what Angela said is the key point for American politics. I think we can talk as much as we want about building mass platforms, but until there's a broad realization about the deep decay in the American ruling class, deep decay, and I use that word advisedly. This is a decadent ruling class. It has stolen wealth for generations. It refused to pay taxes. It refuses to care for the least of them. In the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, they behave like gangsters against Iran. They behave like gangsters against Venezuela. This government has sent a carrier group of warships to blockade Venezuelan ports in the middle of a global pandemic. These are gangsters, and the gap between the leadership of each of the parties is nullified. This is a decadent ruling class. Politics has to be built from below. You cannot build politics inside the shell of a decadent ruling class. Whether it's one party or the other. And I'm not carrying a bucket for the whole conversation about third parties and so on. I don't have a solution. But I think the problem has to be diagnosed correctly. That to believe that the decadent ruling class that sits atop the Democratic Party is going to allow us to move an agenda against the past into the future is an illusion. Bernie Sanders didn't share that illusion. He wanted to use the opportunity to build a movement, not to elect a Democrat into the White House. That wasn't the point. The point is to build an alternative political grammar inside the United States. And I think we should quite fundamentally reject this decadent ruling class. It has no answers to people's problems, none at all. They are a ruling class in cahoots with each other. They behave like gangsters on the world. And I think it's a grave error from now till November to make this kind of blackmailing argument that if you don't get behind Biden, a sex offender, then you'll have Trump, another sex offender in the White House. Whatever happens, American citizens in November are going to have to vote for an alleged sex offender. Think about that for a minute.
Vijay, you just hit the nail on the head too. I want to pick up where we have a real opportunity to generate and build a new common sense, which is what you're saying. There's been years when we have been taught consistently that through trickle-down economics, through Keynesian economics, that if we ingratiate the rich, that it'll all trickle down and fall like manna from heaven, and that is not happening. And I'm now seeing more and more of my friends, not even just my friends, people who I've struggled to convince about the viability of joining Dream Defenders or joining the Bernie movement or joining the left or going to a protest. People have said, no, that's not for me. Literally saying now, you know what? That stuff Bernie was talking now makes a whole lot of sense when they're seeing billionaires and trillionaires get bailed out, right? And so we have in the next few months, I think we have a genuine opportunity. One of my favorite quotes by Amilcar Cabral, he says, tell the people no lies, right? We have a legitimate opportunity over the next few months. They've seen the brutal truth that we're all talking about what the decadence of this economy, the decadence of this empire, right? They want to, but I do believe in my experience in organizing in the last few years and in earnest or in the last few months with the Bernie campaign is that people want to believe that the investment that they're making in an organization, in a vision, actually has the power to coalesce and make it happen. And I think it's something that maybe next week I'll have a different thought, but it's something that's really sitting with me, these conversations that I had with so many people who wanted what we were talking about, but didn't believe that they deserved it or that we could actually make it happen. And I think that we have a real opportunity here to begin to build that because people are seeing a failure of the state, a failure of those wealthy, a failure of the Black excellence, people who tout their wealth and say that it is because we are from excellent Black stock, how they have begun to be silent in this moment. And I think we can make an intervention through organization, but absolutely through political education that people are already getting radicalized in this moment as well.
And Phil, what do you think or others about, and I believe even from the international context, while we want to reject the kind of sameness of the ruling class in the U.S., there's still the imperative of defeating Trump in November. What different kind of approach, what kind of strategic approach can we have to build this independent power that doesn't, rely on people like Biden, but still helps us to get Trump out? You have thoughts on that or others?
Sorry, I missed that. Was that a question to somebody specific?
I was asking Phil, but I think also for anyone. And go ahead. I might not have said it.
No. You said me, and I was conveniently punting. But I'll jump in quickly. I think Vijay said it. I do believe that Senator Sanders saw his campaign as an insurgent campaign, a disruptive campaign into the hegemony, into the hierarchy of the Democratic Party. This was the vehicle that he chose and that he saw. I think people who believe in Senator Sanders, who believe in to a degree Senator Warren, who believe in a progressive value system, a left value system, right, have a duty to continue that disruptive nature within the Democratic Party. I'm talking about in 2020 until November, right? I think we have a responsibility to push the party as far as we can until November to get, and to begin to, because if we do not show any difference between our party's politics and Donald Trump absolutely will win. I'm no longer a part of the campaign, so I can speak more freely. I think Donald Trump has a legitimate chance of absolutely beating Joe Biden. Joe Biden does not have the mental dexterity. He doesn't have the political backbone. He doesn't have the history. He doesn't have the desire to show himself to be a different person than Donald Trump. And he absolutely doesn't have the bona fides. And so we are already in an uphill battle. So what we can do to salvage this moment strategically, I believe, I'm talking domestically, and I'm talking about over the next few months until November, and that's all, is to do everything we can to disrupt the Democratic Party to make it begin to represent what it really could and should be over the next few months. I don't think that's an end game, but I think that's working with what we have right now.
I just want to jump in and say, just amplify, and that is a whole word, point blank, period. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I want to double down and jump in and say, I think it will take us as as the more left groups that are frustrated with that to figure out how we do it together. Because I think we've been trying to take bites of the pie, like one at a time in different ways, and realizing like alone we don't have enough. And so what are the ways that we could actually use the strengths of what we already have and the power we have been building to actually move a strategic plan forward on how to keep disruption going?
I would like to just come at this a different way. I think that the American left is paralyzed by the every 4-year election cycle. And I think that sections of the American left and left liberals tear each other apart for an entire year every 4 years. If you do the math, there's only a few years or months maybe when the left and the left liberals aren't tearing each other apart, because this cycle is so frequent. It comes up again in the midterm cycle. So I think, I understand that elections are important, and I understand that people are deeply disappointed and worried even about Trump. They think of Trump as the ultimate gangster. But I just want to also caution us. The disaster that COVID-19 has occasioned in the United States is not the fault of Mr. Trump. Public health workers have been fired since the great credit crisis of 2008, 2009. That was not Mr. Trump. I'm not defending Trump. I don't think he's not, an insane person. But on the other hand, I think it's too convenient to put everything at his door. The Democratic Party is equally culpable here. And massive cuts, in states across the country from governors, not just the president. So in that regard, I would say that let's not think about November 2020 as such an immense block ahead of us. We need to build a historical project. A historical project is much bigger than this election campaign. It's much bigger than the next election campaign. If you're going to build a historical block, you need, as Philip quite rightly said, you need to believe with Amilcar Cabral, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Go among the people, tell the truth about the ruling class in this country, build campaigns against both the parties. You see, the problem that the left and left liberals face is anytime you put forward a vision, they try to slot you into one of the two parties. You're anti-Trump. Oh, you're a Democrat. No, we are not. We are building a new historical project. We need to have a 20-year, 30-year agenda. Okay, somebody's going to turn around and say climate change, etc. We don't have 30 years. Actually, friends, we do have 30 years. This other thing about we don't have time to build a historical block is actually suffocating us back into neoliberal mainstream democratic policy. We don't have time, therefore we need to get behind them. I don't agree. We have 30 years. Let's build a serious historical project, brings together people across the country who are totally marginalized and dissatisfied with this ruling class. So I would say, caution, November 2020, fine, it's an election. I know that. It's not the end of the world. You know what the end of the world is? If we don't actually build a new historical block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What other people think about that? I mean, it shapes, I think, an urge. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Phil was trying to jump in first, but I have a lot of like feelings and reactions too. But Phil, if you want to
please
for it.
Go
okay.
ahead. Please.
I mean, I was, even at the beginning of this year, really wrestling with the fact that I think we are in a party realignment moment, and I think we often, because the pain is so hard in our communities, we often feel the need to act urgently, and like the foundation of white supremacy also pushes people to act urgently. And I think, we need to be able to like see the forest through the trees on where we need to go and where we're headed, and take the time to make sure that we're doing the work to organize and bring people along on that. And anytime we say that this has to happen and like everything has to happen in 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, like we lose the sight of the further way and the deeper way we could be organizing and bringing people with us.
No, I agree. I think in this moment, I don't want to be liberal, and just agree with everything, but I do think we've got to do both. And I'm grounding this piece of my analysis just in the very real. I agree fully with Vijay, everything that you said, including and especially around Donald Trump becoming an avatar for all the things that the Democrats and the Republicans have done in concert for decades, and the Democrats sometimes going farther, right? And we're seeing actually Joe Biden in some ways be outflanked on the left by Republicans. So I fully agree with that. I do though think that there are very, very real consequences that look different and that are different between the two prospects for a presidency under one and a presidency under another. But really what I was talking about is when we do have an opportunity to push this insufficient, inadequate Democratic Party vehicle to a place that does less harm. And maybe that's the most we can get out of it. But if we could do less harm, I think doing that in addition to the historic project that is a generational project, a 10, 20-year project where we don't have to scramble every 4 years to register voters or engage voters or educate voters, but where we have built genuine, organic, revolutionary people who see, who understand, who can make decisions, who gather, who are democratic organizations locally and statewide, and they are part of those things. And I think we can do both. But I have seen the great harm, and Vijay, I know you have as well. This is not a condemnation of that, but the great harm that has come and is represented by the right now. And if we can prevent the Democratic Party from moving even further to the right, maybe we should try to do that before November.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to ask a question, I'll ask this broadly, but if nobody jumps in, I'll ask somebody specifically. But there are sort of, there's on the one hand sort of the shared assessment on the call so far. I think that there's that the ruling class occupies both parties, the sort of top tiers of both parties, and that fundamentally it's important that we're building independent political power, that we can really build an alternative historic bloc, to use Vijay or Gramsci's terms, and then there's maybe like a question about whether or not the Democratic Party itself is a terrain of struggle, or it could be organized into becoming a political vehicle that serves some movement purpose, or whether it's, whether the strategy is oppose primarily and build outside. And I think that is a bit of a question coming up here. So I'm wondering where people sort of land on that, and if that's a productive question. Because I think in some ways, Vijay, the impetus with the kind of political position you're stating, which I more or less agree with, is like the question that comes back to us is the one that Phil raised earlier. If we're going to if we need a new organization to hold the historic bloc, what is that organization? It's not sufficient to just be an amalgam of the existing networks of community organizations. So where do people sort of fall on that question?
Let me just clarify what I was saying a little bit, because I think your question has already been answered in reality, which is, the the way the question is framed is politics or electoralism is reduced to the presidential cycle. But the question has already been answered at the more local level. You know, the very fact that in congressional seats, you have now people of the left like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez contesting against right-wing Democrats, winning seats. At the state level, in state assemblies, in state legislatures, you have again people from the left contesting against right-wing Democrats and winning. I think this is very important. You know, I don't want you to hear what I'm saying as saying that we don't need to engage with the political institutions and formations that are out there. The question is at what level? You know, at the level of these, in these seats, these rotten seats where Democrats win routinely, they must always be challenged on the left. I think that's a big lesson. You know, in these congressional districts, in these state level elections, there are many seats where Democrats just win by the fact of being on the ballot. They just don't get challenged. They must have challengers from the left, every single one of them. That's how you build a historical project. As challenging some of these people, you're out there articulating the agenda, and you then put forward a different view of the world. I think this is essential.
Yeah, I think to add to that, something that I think is really important that Phillip said that really resonated with me is we need people to be able to think that they deserve more. I think the struggle with this two-party system is that either you're here or you're here, and that's it. There's no in between. You have to fall into one box or another. Otherwise, you're not falling in line. You're spoiling the system, whatever moderates want to say. And I think it's really important for us to think about what it means to thrive. You know, we talk a lot about thriving and not just surviving day to day, not just living paycheck to paycheck, not just getting pulled over by the police and then hoping that you survive. Like, that's a real low bar. And I think we really need to start to think about what we actually deserve. We see that there's other communities. We see the elites. We see all sorts of folks that are in power that are over here thriving off the backs of marginalized people. And we're over here sometimes being taught to just settle for crumbs because that's what the two-party system has allowed. And so what does it mean to thrive and to think big? And I think a lot of folks, when you're trying to survive day to day due to the ills of, capitalism, white supremacy, misogyny, all these, intersecting issues, it's really hard to think about thriving because the system is so flawed that you just want to survive day to day. You want to make the most of what you have. And I know people of color, I know Black folks specifically, we make $1 out of 15 cents. We figure it out. But that's not acceptable anymore. And I think sometimes we also need permission from each other to say, you know what, let's dream big and then work towards that dream, because there's nothing stopping us from dreaming and asking for better, because Lord knows that white supremacy and those in the elite are able to get exactly what they're looking for. We operate from a place of scarcity when we really need to be operating from a place of abundance, that there is enough for all of us. And no matter what you look like, no matter your sexual orientation and preference and all of that, we all deserve to thrive. And we need to honestly kind of like shut this system down until we all are equitable. And I think the Democratic Party allows us to just concede and say, you know what, we're going to settle for this. It's not everything that I want, but it's better than here, which is also not acceptable either, when, quite frankly, both systems are destructive to marginalized communities.
Yeah, I want to jump in kind of where you were going, Angela, and like a thing that I'm really trying to push myself in right now is like, I actually think the question you asked is kind of false, because it's getting us to pick between one thing or the other. And that goes deep into what you were saying, Angela, around like scarcity thinking. And I think we need to figure out, how can we hold everything that we want to hold, and who makes sense in which place to hold that and move that in alignment with one another? So it's a both and question. We need both of them. And then the question becomes, to what level of capacity and who is going to be the right people to make the push in different ways?
I'm going to say something, and I don't mean this to be controversial, but it is provocative. I think also every 4 years, every 2 years, it becomes very clear that a lot of the organizations or the grassroots groups or the national groups that we proclaim and we tout aren't doing the work of organizing. We aren't knocking on doors. We aren't having conversations with people. And every time we get beat or every time we lose or every time we lose a little bit of ground, it hurts. Not because, well, obviously because we didn't win the campaign or we didn't win and by campaign, I don't mean election. I mean campaign or the election or whatever the goal was. It is because we could have if we were just doing the work every single day. And I know that there are structural barriers, there are financial barriers in the way, but I'm not going to give a post-mortem. No one needs that right now, but we shouldn't be losing for many more elections, and we shouldn't be losing very many more campaigns if the numbers bear out that more than half of the country supports our agenda. More than half of the country wants the world that we are talking about, but they haven't been talked to, they haven't been spoken with, they haven't been listened to, they haven't been organized. And I think we have to look at the enemy. We have to look at the other organizations that are working against us. But we've also there's a speech that I love by Jesse Jackson, but he talks about rocks just laying around, and not that there are people waiting to be saved, but there are people we shouldn't be losing for long. Maybe I think these are the last campaigns and elections that we should be losing, and that our opposition absolutely knows that, and is building an ideological and consolidating their power in a way that prevents what should be victories for the left if we were really doing the work that we proclaim. And I think a lot of nonprofit groups are not doing the work that they say that they're doing.
Yeah, that was actually a question we kind of wanted to pose to folks is, it's clearly in the United States, and I don't know exactly relative to other countries, but we know that in the United States, there's a lot of people that still are not organized, are not in social justice, progressive community organization of one type or another. Fewer people are in unions, et cetera. And it seems like a lot of the electoral efforts and big kind of national coalitions and things don't really pay attention to organizing until they just want to get, our folks, our organizations out and want numbers. But there's a challenge about actually, strategies to organize, get people into organizations, and particularly Black organizations, brown organizations. What are you guys seeing? What's the kind of strategy to get past this weakness of, overall low organization in the United States? How can we get to where Phil is saying that we're headed towards where we should be winning? So, Laurel from People's Action, or Angela, if you want to talk about kind of what you all are thinking about ways to build organizations in this period.
Yeah, I think for us, we always try to ground ourselves and center ourselves in the folks that are most directly impacted. In Wisconsin, there's a zip code 53206 that is home to, the most incarcerated zip code in the world. And in the state of Wisconsin, if you are still on supervision, on probation or parole, your voting rights are not restored yet. And so there are times people just go through neighborhoods and just don't even talk to folks because they think, oh, you're not politically engaged, you don't care. I think there's this idea that folks are apathetic. And what does it look like to bring in people who cannot provide a vote for you and make sure that they're still being listened to, they're engaged, they're talked to. And so I think it's expanding this idea, and it's not just rooted in civic engagement. That's the word. It's the phrase I like to use, but that's mostly for funders and other stuff. But what does it look like to really center power for those that are typically overlooked and cannot provide you with anything? And I've read so many think pieces about how Wisconsin is going to be the state. Black voters are going to be the demographic that sway the election. And so with that being said, and if that's something that I'm seeing and I'm hearing, I'm going to center and use that as a point of leverage with the Democratic Party. If there's presidential candidates that want to come in, you need to earn our support, and being able to leverage that and withhold that. And I think it's not just, trying to bluff your way through it, but really standing on your power and saying, we're not doing this. You need us more than we honestly need you. And we need some real concrete plans. We need to make sure that we have a voice. And then no matter what, even if we do have a seat at the table, and this is something that we've seen with our elected officials going through having this election yesterday, is that we have direct lines to, the governor's office and other elected officials' office. And just because we have those direct lines doesn't mean we also aren't organizing. And so I think there's also, going back to what Phillip was saying, is that there are some nonprofits that just like to work within having these power structures. They want to have that access, but you can do both. You can be able to organize on the outside and build that power and work from within. And something I've been thinking a lot about is this like outside inside strategy. And we need to be able to do multiple things all at once and on a year-round basis, and really understand what it means to build power and what it means to identify power. There's a lot of us that don't even agree on what power even is. And so how are we even building it collectively? But how are we centering folks in a way in building our own power and saying, you know what, if you're not going to be down with our demands and what we want you to do, we're going to sit this out. And we know that the Democratic Party is so scared, and there's a point of leverage there in order to make sure that some of our demands are being met. Obviously, not all of them are going to get met, but there needs to be enough. And there also needs to be basic respect. I think there's so many times I've heard rumors where people have talked behind my back, oh, Angela just needs to be quiet. Oh, Angela just needs to fall in line. The heck we do. We have the power in this scenario, and I'm going to act like it, and I'm going to show it despite what you think. And I think we just need to, have honest conversations around that, because it seems that, there are the powers that be and the elite are acting like bullies and just saying, oh, we need to fall in line, and that's unacceptable. And so I think, going back to it, I think we just need to really understand the power that we have and not give that away. And what does it look like to have a united front and have all these organizations and groups that are working together to say, look, y'all have some real problems. We know that they're not going to be solved by the November election, but this is what you need to do. Otherwise, we are fully okay with walking away and not organizing our people.
Yeah. One last thing that I'm just thinking about as you were talking, Angela, is there's another equation in the mix too, and that's our funders. And I think we have to get like there in our movement, there is we fight each other for the same crumbs, and we are doing it in a way that pushes us to say, oh, whichever organization can knock on the most doors and produce the much should get the most money. And that's what we fight for, when I think we're finding alignment on this call that we need a deeper level of organizing and a deeper level of relating to our electoral strategies and approaches. And I think that's going to be bigger than one organization can solve on its own. We have to figure it out together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. As we move to close, I want to ask one last question to the group. And Vijay, we'll start with you. You've pointed to some of the continuities between sort of the moment that we're in with previous moments in terms of the behavior of the ruling class. One thing that's particularly notable about this period, of course, is sort of the rise of the far right, and it's very much not just a U.S. phenomenon, of course. Can you talk about what you sort of see are the strategic opportunities to counter the rise of the right, both sort of in the halls of power and outside, here in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Well, it actually starts, I think, Rishi, with how you diagnose the right. What is the far right? If you see the far right as a bunch of, dispossessed racists in marginal areas who hold some of the most disgusting opinions, I think you will not be able to defeat them, because they are merely the symptom. If you understand the far right as essentially an alliance of the very, very small plutocracy that has siphoned off people's wealth over generations, and the kind of political project that they pushed forward, the neoliberal project, which delegitimized itself, and then seeking mass support, they put their eggs behind these really vicious politicians, so that you have this strange alliance between these vicious politicians, Viktor Orban in Hungary, You have, of course, Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, but they are very intimately linked to the moneyed interests. There's no gap between the two of them. I think this game that is being played by liberals again, where you have, a socially liberal moneyed element and then the far right moneyed element, and we're supposed to rally behind the George Soros of the world to take on the far right's money. I think this is a great illusion. It's a great illusion because we forget that George Soros, for instance, bankrupted Russia in the 1990s. School teachers couldn't get their salaries. University professors were on the street. This person is not a liberal. They created the conditions for the far right to emerge with such viciousness. I think you really need to have a sense of building a people's project against the far right and the right. It's not a question of somehow going after somebody with a Confederate flag and a gun and saying they are the problem. They are just the symptoms of the problem. The problem is much deeper than that. There's a kind of class bias way the far right is getting portrayed as a working class white guy with some offensive ideas. I think just getting rid of that guy from the picture doesn't solve the problem.
That's right.
I also just jump in, think it is our work as organizers to bring people into our vision and our world and our reality. And so to just write somebody off, that is not organizing to me. It takes time, it takes work, it takes effort. And when we just shut people out, we're never going to get the kind of power we need to actually fight the real problem at hand.
Yeah, I think for me, it's yes, there's the right, but then it's also we need to fight white supremacy and capitalism, which exist on both sides. And I think a lot of us don't like to admit that sometimes. And it's just because you're not wearing a white pointy hood doesn't mean you aren't just complicit in white supremacy. And those are real tough conversations to have. If I had a dime for every time I was called an angry Black woman, either explicitly or subtly, I would be part of the elite, quite frankly. And what does it look like to really think about and have this analysis all across the board? And yes, it takes time to be able to have these conversations, because I think there's a lot of folks that don't feel that they identify with one side or another. They're just trying to provide for their families. They're just trying to survive. And I think this is a point where a lot of us organizers, this is an agitational moment, and this is a learning moment that we can say, hey, this is all messed up. You can see what's happening, what's playing out, how Congress is acting or not acting in order to help people in this moment. And I think there's a real opportunity for education, and again, to try and get people to think about dreaming big, and that, we don't need to limit ourselves. And and at the same time, we need to talk about white supremacy, capitalism in all forms. And I think a lot of times it's very easy to scapegoat it and say, oh, that's the right. I think they're more obvious and blunt about it. And I think it's very easy to point out specific scenarios. But the amount of white supremacy I've seen in the last weeks, on both sides in the state of Wisconsin has been disgusting. And then yet here we are expected to just fall in line for candidates that put out dog whistle commercials and expect us just to vote. And I think there's a real point to disrupt this moment right now. And I think, yes, there's broader conversations that need to happen. But I encourage us to think about not just the right. Like I said before, I think it's a little bit more obvious, but it's happening on both sides. Like Vijay talked about, we need to really talk about the elite and the ruling class, and Democrats are just complicit in that as well.
Well, hopefully, we have to wrap up. You want to go out, get a last word or so?
No, I'm going to wear my artist hat. It is the duty of artists to make revolution irresistible. The left needs to make music, make art, engage in a cultural war, make some dope stuff.
Thank you. Well, hopefully you all did get lifted up a bit through this hour-long conversation. Just to remind everybody, go to organizingupgrade.com. That's the kind of source of this material and ongoing conversation, and also to watch, or if you want other people to watch this show later. Our next show is on April 29th, same time. the guests that Rishi mentioned previously. And Rishi, want to close out with anything?
Yeah, well, thank you everyone very much for participating. Thanks to our brilliant guests, to Real News, to the rest of our organizing upgrade team working behind the scenes, and all of you watching. We work really hard on this show to help our guests sort of get past mainstream liberal conceptions of how politics really works and about how our strategy should proceed. So I hope we got something out of that tonight. These are tough times for the left and for everyone, but I think as our guests really helped us get clear, there's a ton of opportunity and it's ours to take. Our hope is that with each other and out of struggle, we can turn this crisis into transformation. Let's do it. Let's do it together. We want to, encourage everyone to take care of yourselves, take care of each other in the meantime. In the words of Bernie, be willing to fight for someone you don't know. And from Organizing Upgrade and Real News, good night until the next episode. Thanks, everyone.